There was a lot of talk after the war and trying to explain what had happened about inhumanity. But I am sorry, there is no such thing as inhumanity. There is only humanity and more humanity. Hey everyone, welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Jonathan Littell's 2009 novel, The Kindly Ones, translated from the French by Charlotte Mandell. This is a very polarizing and very controversial book. As I was doing research on this book and looking at other reviews, mainly everyone either gives this book 1 star or 5 stars. And I want to note up front that this might be less of a review and more of a reaction, as for some reason I thought that coming at this book without a script might be more appropriate, so just be warned that this video might be a bit more messy than some of my other videos. But I have very mixed feelings about this book. This book is clearly problematic from the start. You're inside the head of an absolute monster, similar to Lolita in a lot of ways. But I actually really like the idea of the book, because I think it is necessary to consider the viewpoints of these people. And I need to be really clear here. We're never asked to sympathize with our main character, nor I think should we ever sympathize with him. But I do think that we should make some effort to try to understand him. I don't think we'll ever fully understand him, but we should try to understand him in any way that we can. I mean, and this seems to be controversial, but I do think that we should view Nazis as human beings. Not for their sake, of course, but for our own sake. I think we run into problems when we don't accept this fact. And I think this actually comes out of some of the ways that we teach the Holocaust and we teach about Nazis and stuff like that. I'll get back to that at the end. But anyways, let's back this up. What is this book about? This book is a fictional memoir of a certain Maximilian Aue. And Aue is a Nazi. He's an SS officer. And this entire book is told from the first person. It's a memoir, and we're in his head the entire book. And essentially we follow him throughout World War II and all of the depravities and heinous acts that he commits, we witness through him. And he's at all of these very monumental events throughout the war. He's at the Battle of Stalingrad, for instance. He's at one of the final death marches to Auschwitz. He's at the fall of Berlin. So we get all of these events that we all know the names of and we've all read about in history books through the perspective of an SS officer. This book is about the depravity of humanity, and it really asks us to consider why and how these people did what they did. I mean, this is how the book opens. "Oh, my human brothers, let me tell you how it happened. I am not your brother," you'll retort, "and I don't want to know." And it certainly is true that this is a bleak story, but an edifying one too, a real morality play, I assure you. You might find it a bit long, a lot of things happened after all, but perhaps you're not in too much of a hurry. With a little luck, you'll have some time to spare. And also, this concerns you. You'll see that this concerns you. Don't think I'm trying to convince you of anything. After all, your opinions are your own business. I mean, this is just a brilliant opening, but this book throughout, and as you can see from the opening lines, has a confessional vibe as Aue is kind of confessing his life to us. But importantly, he's not, doesn't seem to be anyways, looking for forgiveness or salvation. It's actually pretty unclear throughout why he's telling us the things that he's telling us. It seems to me anyways that it's a form of narcissism, that he just wants to tell his story. But it is a bit more complicated than that. But I really like this opening because it reminds me very much of Cormac McCarthy's Child of God, which on the second page of that novel tells us about Lester Ballard, that novel's protagonist, who is if you don't know, a serial killing necrophiliac. But on the second page, when it's describing Lester Ballard, it says that he is a child of God, much like yourself, perhaps. And that perhaps is, of course, doing a lot of work. As you're asked to consider throughout that novel, is Lester Ballard a child of God just like me? And I think here in The Kindly Ones, we're asked to consider the same exact question. Is he our human brother? But by doing this, this opening really asks us to consider causation. Who or what caused Max Aue to do what he did? Littell did extensive research on the Nuremberg trials, and it's clear that he was highly influenced by the Nuremberg trials, and this book is, in some ways, I think, an exposition of those trials. And I'll come back to that. But more generally, I think this is a really interesting problem, and a problem that I think should still plague us. Now, I'm not equivocating any of these events to the Holocaust by any means, but the moral question, I think, is the same. Think of something like the Iraq War, a war that left hundreds of thousands, if not millions, the number is very unclear, obviously, of Iraqis dead. Who's to blame for that? Is it just the soldiers that we blame? Is it Bush, Cheney, Colin Powell? Is it every member of Congress who voted for that war? And if so, do we blame every single citizen who cast a vote for that representative? And even more broadly, I think this book is quite a bit about imperialism, which is still destroying lives around the world. I mean, to take an example, this shirt was made in, I believe, Indonesia. Under what circumstances, I don't know, but if it came out that the circumstances were quite bad, would I be to blame? I just bought this shirt at my local Target. You know, there's that saying that there's no ethical consumption in capitalism. But I think all of these questions are very similar, and they're very much about free will and responsibility. And in fact, in this opening chapter, which is absolutely brilliant, by the way, Awa implicates us being people who live in the West, essentially. I mean, he notes at various times that the Nazis looked towards European colonizers for inspiration, and especially they looked towards how the US government genocided the Native Americans. He also criticizes the Little Vietnam Adventure, as he calls it, the Vietnam War, and basically points out that, you know, we're not that different. And essentially what he argues is that it wasn't psychopaths who did any of these crimes. They were just ordinary people. There are psychopaths everywhere, all the time. Our quiet suburbs are crawling with pedophiles and maniacs. Our homeless shelters are packed with raving megalomaniacs. And some of them do indeed become a problem. They kill 2, 3, 10, even 50 people. And then the very same state that would, without batting an eye, send them to war, crushes them like a blood-swollen mosquito. These sick men are nothing. But the ordinary men that make up the state, especially in unstable times, now there's the real danger. The real danger for mankind is me, is you. And if you're not convinced of this, don't bother to read any further. You'll understand nothing, and you'll get angry, with little profit for you or for me. One of the really interesting parts of the experience of reading this book for me is that I always needed to be on my toes and ready to combat Max Aua. That is, you need to be aware that he is in some way trying to convince you of something, and you need to be ready, and you better be ready, to push back on these ideas. And again, the opening part of this fictional memoir, I think is just really, really brilliant. Whether you agree with it or not, I think it does raise a lot of questions that are still highly relevant to this day. There's a famous example from the Nuremberg trials of the question of who is more guilty, the person who pulls the trigger or the train conductor? Can you even blame the train conductor at all? And again, I think this is incredibly relevant today. I've never killed anyone, but my government has. And one of the reasons why I have the life that I have and the material wealth that I have is due to imperialism and genocide. Let me actually just read one more passage from this opening chapter, as I think it's just really, it's really something. But I don't think I'm a devil. There were always reasons for what I did. Good reasons or bad reasons, I don't know. In any case, human reasons. Those who kill are humans, just like those who are killed. That's what's terrible. You can say, I shall never kill. That's impossible. The most you can say is, I hope I shall never kill. I too hope so. I too wanted to live a good and useful life, to be a man among men, equal to others. I too wanted to add my brick to our common house. But my hopes were dashed, and my sincerity was betrayed and placed at the services of an ultimately evil and corrupt work. And I crossed over to the dark shores, and all this evil entered my own life. And none of this can be made whole, ever. These words are of no use either. They disappear like water in the sand. this wet sand that fills my mouth. I live. I do what can be done. It's the same for everyone. I am a man like other men. I am a man like you. I tell you, I am just like you. For me, the biggest problems with this book begin with Max Auer's character. He is fascinating and absolutely insufferable. He's long-winded, easily distracted, he's manipulative, he's a liar, but he's seductive in some ways. He's very well read. He's an intellectual. He's a lawyer by training, but he wanted to go into literary studies, essentially. He was much more interested in literature and poetry, but his parents forced him into law, and he resents them quite a bit for that. But so this book is rife with all of these references and allusions to classical music and classical literature. And all of this actually kind of reminds me a little bit of Book 6 of Karl Knausgaard's My Struggle, as this kind of yearning for this intellectual, artistic life, but being forced into something else. Kind of reminds me of the 400-page biography of Hitler in that book, as this lifestyle, or this problem in life kind of mirrors Hitler's own life. But essentially, Max Auer is an SS officer. He's an SS bureaucrat. He holds the rank of Sturmbannführer for most of this book. And throughout this book, he is tasked with all of these various, to him, very banal tasks. He's asked to go investigate the best way to solve the Jewish question. He's asked to go to the Eastern Front and research the nutritional diets of the soldiers there. So that's why he's at all of these big events. But Auer is at the heart very untrustworthy. He's obviously quite evil in a lot of ways. He does all of these heinous things. He's also very perverse sexually. He's in love with his twin sister, and they consummated that love at a very young age. Auer is just untrustworthy, pretty evil, and he's self-deluded, but he never really fully recognizes that he is evil. And so Auer is a very odd witness to these events, of course, right? I think we're more used to, when we read about the Holocaust, we're more used to reading something like Tadeusz Borowski or Primo Levi or these other authors in which the witness to the events are the victims. And I think that's well and good. And so Littell's choice to change this focus to the focus of the perpetrator rather than the victim is obviously, it was quite controversial, and he got a lot of pushback and still continues to get a lot of pushback for this choice. But he defended this choice in an interesting way. And let me just read you what he says. He said that the perpetrators are the ones who are doing something and changing the reality. It's very easy to understand the victim. Something terrible happens to him and he acts accordingly. But in terms of trying to understand something, there is nothing to examine. The perpetrator is more complicated to understand, along with the apparatus that activates him. By means of the attempt to give a voice to the perpetrator, lessons can be learned that will affect the way we look at the world today. Now, I don't fully agree with that statement. I think we can learn quite a bit from the victims, but I think it's an interesting point. But Auer is sort of one-dimensional in a way. He doesn't like killing. There's a few scenes where he kind of goes mad when he is forced to kill himself, but he never fully considers the larger apparatus that he's a part of. And he's a part of some really bad apparatuses. He's a part of the Einsatzgruppen, for one, the SS mobile killing unit, who was responsible for most of the ethnic cleansing, the murdering. And Auer does have all of these other interesting personality traits. He's in love with his sister, his twin sister. He hates his mother and his stepfather. So there is this heir to Greek tragedy vibes going through this book. And I'll come back, I'll touch on that just a little bit at the end. And of course, Auer is queer, which obviously goes against his Nazi ideology, but he doesn't really even recognize it as that. Like, he can't even see the contradiction that's inherent in that. But so a large part of this book, I should have warned at the start, a large part of this book is very sexually explicit. It's very similar in some ways to Péter Nádas's parallel stories. But this book is also just filled with just so many great moments. It's maximalist to its core. It's about as maximalist as you can possibly get. It includes dissertations worth of research. Littell apparently spent like 18 months traveling on the Eastern Front and doing research before writing this book. And this book at times reads like a history book. It's sprawling in both breadth and depth as we witness all of these different events, but it penetrates so deeply into each of these events. It's almost more of a history book than a history book, as it shows you the history rather than just telling it to you. I don't know. I think this book is very interested in the breakdown between fiction and nonfiction, especially when it comes to describing these horrendous events. But I think there are parts of this book that are just absolutely magnificent. For my money, the description of the Battle of Stalingrad in this book is some of the best descriptions of the Eastern Front, of the war in and around Ukraine. The first half of this book takes place in Ukraine. It's one of the best descriptions of the Battle of Stalingrad that I've ever read, and it's insanely gruesome and filled with just so much detail. And that's actually an important part of this book. This book overwhelms you with detail, and I think there's a reason for it. I think there's a rhetorical trick at the heart of this book. It overwhelms you with detail to the point where you forget that you're dealing with a monster. This book is bloated to all hell. But I think the reason that Awa includes all of this information, all of this bureaucratic information, is I think he hopes that he'll overwhelm you with details and you'll forget that at the core of this novel is a Nazi murdering a bunch of innocent people. Like I mentioned earlier, a large part of this book reads like a nonfiction book, as we get an immense amount of detail about the bureaucracy of the SS. There's all these acronyms. There's a glossary in the back that explains all of these acronyms because there's so many. And in fact, it's these details, these historical details that are really the meat of this book. It's why the book is almost 1,000 pages. And I mean, each page is filled margin to margin. There's almost no paragraph breaks throughout this entire book. So the main part of this book is historical detail, not the killings or the murders or the sex, but the piles of information. It's almost like a Gish Gallop in some way, in that the information overwhelms you, that you forget that just a few pages earlier he was working with the Einsatzgruppen. This book focuses on the bureaucracy behind genocide. This book is really about the bureaucratization of evil, the bureaucratization of genocide. And obviously, it's similar in a lot of respects to Hannah Arendt's idea of the banality of evil, which she explained, I think, in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. But there's a part pretty early on, actually, where Awa sits down and does the math as to figure out how many people died in each country, each week, each day, each hour, each minute. And it's this really just cold scientific calculation that is so disturbing. It's so dehumanizing, so anti-human, but that's exactly how we talk about the Holocaust. That's exactly how we teach the Holocaust. Everyone knows the numbers, but what good does the number 6 million do when I can't fathom the number 6 million? When we study the Holocaust, when we study World War II, we can't, at least I should speak for myself, I guess, I can't fully wrap my head around the scale of almost any of this. That is, when I try to understand the Holocaust, I get lost in the details. And Awa seems to be playing with that human fault. And anyways, there are just so many disturbing moments in this book, and I'll spare you most of them. But there's one scene at the Battle of Stalingrad that is, well, disturbing as all hell, but it's interesting because they're all starving, right? If you know anything about the Battle of Stalingrad, didn't end too well for the Nazis, but they're starving, so they're trying to figure out who they should eat. So they gotta resort to cannibalism. And there's a long discussion of, do we eat one of the Hiwis or do we eat a German? That is, do we eat one of the people that we think are subhuman, literally, or do we eat someone who is, part of the Aryan race? And they go through this racial and moral reasoning as to which one they should eat, which one would make more rational, rational sense. And it's so disturbing, but what's most disturbing is that they completely ignored the question of whether or not they should even eat someone in the first place. And this happens again and again. Towards the end of this book, Awa finds himself in between a debate between Eichmann and Albert Speer, who the former wants to, kill as many Jews as possible, and the latter wants to enslave them and put them in work camps to do more work. But so the language throughout this book is all about the efficiency of genocide and completely ignores the question of whether or not this genocide should even happen. And one of the main problems with this book is that there is no light. There's no real pushback to any of these ideologies. It's up to the reader, to you, to push back against these. And you better be ready to push back. I mean, I think there's really only one part. There's one character in this book that really pushes back against this. And this is a guy named Voss, who is interested in Indo-European languages, especially in the Caucasus region. And he has this great, very long speech in which he berates the logic and the facts of the Nazis, of their ideologies. And it's absolutely wonderful. But, something happens to him very quickly after that. And that's really the only pushback we get in this entire book. I mean, Max does do some philosophizing. I mean, he does a ton of philosophizing throughout this book as he tries to figure out, questions like, is man naturally evil or naturally good? Actually, let me just read you a little bit. What I wanted to say is that if man is certainly not, as some poets and philosophers have made him out to be, naturally good, he is not naturally evil either. Good and evil are categories that can serve to qualify the effect of the action of one man on another, but they are, in my opinion, fundamentally unsuitable, even unusable, to judge what goes on in the heart of that man. Dole killed people or had them kill, so he's evil. But within himself, he was a good man to those close to him, indifferent to all others, and what's more, one who respected the law. What more do we ask of the individual in our civilized democratic cities? And how many philanthropists throughout the world made famous by their extravagant generosity are, on the contrary, monsters of egotism and harshness, greedy for public glory, full of vanity, tyrannical towards those close to them. So yeah, there's a lot of that in this book, but I think what most people would find interesting in this book is all of the historical detail. Again, we meet all of these historical people that we know the names of, right? Eichmann, Speer, Hitler, as Max kind of meets up with them and works for them usually. And it's sort of Forrest Gump style as he's brought around Europe to all of these big events that I listed earlier. And I've read a lot of criticism about this. I've read a few other reviews of this book, and a lot of people criticize this because it's unrealistic. And for me, I don't really care about realism at this point. I mean, any description of the Holocaust is about as surreal as it gets. It feels so unreal anyways. And I think it's pretty clear from pretty early on that Awa isn't really an individual. He isn't really a single person. He's very much an amalgam for Nazism, for the Nazis. He is the Nazi Party, which explains his insufferable attitude and irrationality. Again, this is a maximalist book, but there is a plot in the backbone of this book, and there's plenty of subplots. The subplots kind of vary for me. Some of them are quite interesting, and many of them are just downright silly and kind of weird and unnecessary in my opinion. There's one subplot where Awa is being investigated for a murder, and the whole situation just reads very strangely. But the more general plot of this book is the rise and fall of the Third Reich. We follow the Nazis from basically the Battle of Stalingrad to the bitter end in Berlin when Berlin falls. And this book is really structured around some Greek tragedies by Aeschylus and some other stuff. I mean, The Kindly Ones refers to the Furies in one of Aeschylus' trilogies. And so there are all of these allusions to classical Greek books, Greek plays, and stuff like that that I won't really get into. I'll let someone else handle that, I think. There really is just no solace in this book, but there are moments that, I mean, for me anyways, they just absolutely floored me. Ever since the beginnings of human history, war has always been regarded as the ultimate evil. But we had invented something compared to which war had come to seem clean and pure, something from which many were already trying to escape by taking refuge in the elementary certainties of war and the front. Even the insane butcheries of the Great War, which our fathers or some of our older officers had lived through, seemed almost clean and righteous compared to what we had brought into the world. I found this extraordinary. It seemed to me that there was something crucial in this, and that if I could understand it, then I'd understand everything and could finally rest. By the end of this book, we don't really learn about what led to Nazism. We're just reminded of the humanity of Nazism, which, again, I think is a controversial idea, but I do think that it is a good reminder. I think the way we teach the Holocaust, I taught high school just for like a year or so, the way we teach the Holocaust is that it was a unique evil brought to fruition by uniquely evil people. But that wasn't the case. It was based on a long and learned tradition. I mean, anti-Semitism goes back thousands of years. Go read about anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages. Almost every country in Western Europe, or every kingdom in Western Europe, kicked the Jews out or ethnically cleansed the Jews from their country throughout the Middle Ages. There were genocides abounding. But I think if you accept this, rather than the idea that this was a unique evil, it puts it into a context in which then we can start addressing some of the roots of this problem, rather than just saying, oh, they were so evil, that could never happen again. Of course it could happen again, which is why it's so terrifying. The problem here in The Kindly Ones is that Awa never fully confronts the evil apparatus that he's a part of, which I think is kind of the point. I think this book is well worth reading. I think it's probably like 300 pages too long, but the essential conceit of this novel, I think, is worth exploring. It's insanely uncomfortable, but I think that's a good thing. I think literature should make you uncomfortable. But this book is honestly just one of the most disturbing books I've ever read. It's like if Blood Meridian was told only from the perspective of the judge. And I'm not really sure, honestly, where I fall on the is this a masterpiece or is this garbage scale. I'm very glad that I read it, and I think I will return to it in the future, probably quite far into the future, to be fair. But let me know if you've read this book. I'm genuinely very interested in knowing what other people have made of this book. I mean, it's a 1,000-page fictional memoir of a Nazi. I'm sure people have opinions, and I'd love to hear them. So let me know what you think. And for now, thanks for watching.